All right, we're going to get started. We're going to be still in 2 Peter chapter 1. We are getting towards the end of this chapter, though, so we'll see how far we get today, actually starting on time for once, with me actually here on time for once. So we just finished up talking. Peter had gone through and listed off a number of different qualities that we want to have as Christians. And he talks about adding one quality to another, not in the sense of, get this quality, and then when you're done getting this quality, add the next quality. He's saying in the sense of layer these things. And as you grow, you layer, and you develop more complexity, you develop more ability. And so the idea is, the ultimate of all of those, what was the most important of all of the qualities that you layer on all the rest of them? Love. Okay, I'm glad we remember that one. That's kind of important. Although, as someone once said, there's 3 right answers to almost any question in Bible class: Jesus, God, and love. So, as long as you pick the right context, you're going to get it. Paul, if the question is who wrote it, then Paul is the best. Yeah. So okay. So we're going to move on now. And Peter, after going through it, and saying these are the qualities, he then says, "For he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins." And this is a really important point, and it's something we ought to remember pretty consistently with most of the letters that we read. These letters are written to Christians. They're not written to people who are in the world. Now, people in the world can learn things from them. That's absolutely true. But these letters are written to Christians, and by and large, the instructions that we find, whether it's Paul or Peter or any of them, they are focused on what Christians need to do. And in many cases, the things that are problematic about what Christians are doing right here. And so what Peter is suggesting is that some people that he's writing to have forgotten, not just that they didn't get there, it's that they've kind of forgotten what this purification was and what it meant to them. So it's important for us to recognize that these qualities that we've gone through and looked at the last several weeks are tied into and should flow out of our salvation as Christians. These are not the sort of things that are, some people have them and some people don't. I don't know how many of you have had a conversation with someone where they said, well, I just don't have patience. God didn't give me patience. Well, you better go get some, Or I've never heard anybody say, I don't have any love. That would be a weird thing to say. Yeah, I don't care. I don't like anybody. But when you go through and you look at those different qualities, there are people who want to say, well, I don't really have to do that. Somebody else will do that. I don't really. And there's certainly places in the scriptures where we find spiritual gifts listed, and they aren't ones that all of us necessarily have. Teaching or some of the public speaking and public roles in particular. But even then, all of us should have at least a little bit of ability to teach and a little bit of ability to speak when the time is right. Maybe not to get up in front of the whole church and speak, or the church the size my parents go to right now that has like 600 people and speak, but certainly the ability to, when we're talking to somebody, to be able to say, hey, here's something to think about over here, to be able to kind of just pull some knowledge out and share that with people. We all should be able to do that in some context. We all should be able to serve. We all should be able to do those kinds of things. And so the gifts that we think about as Christians, they're things that all of us have to a greater or lesser extent, and none of us are ever really given a pass from having any responsibility for doing those things. Maybe it's less responsibility, and certainly as we become more, whether it's physically limited or, in terms of our ability to get around or whatever, we become more limited in being able to do certain things, but nevertheless, we all have a role to play in building up the body and strengthening it, and particularly in these Christian qualities that Paul has been talking about, which don't require you to be able to lift things or run really fast, or they're not a physical related thing. They're how you think about people and how you treat people. So Peter, I'm stuck on that now. He is talking about this idea that if you lack the qualities, you're blind or short-sighted. Therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you. For as long as you practice these things, you will never stumble. For in this way, the entrance into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will be abundantly supplied to you. So, one of the things I want to talk about real quick here is this thing he says in verse 10, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you. Now, our Calvinistic denominations believe that this is evidence of the idea that you have this calling, and if you're called, you're in, and if you're not called, you aren't. And so to them, the idea about doing good and being obedient is more about proving that you're calling and not about actually something that you really have any choice about. So on the one hand, they say, you know, you've been called, and it's not your control. It's what they call an irresistible call to God. On the other hand, they say, but you should still make every effort to do the right thing so you can show that you were legitimately called. And I always thought that was a little confusing to me. It's a very difficult, I've said, in terms of ranking the complexity of the level of thinking you have to have when it comes to religious things, Jesuit priests are at the highest because they have to justify every new pope's ideas about what the scriptures say. And right underneath them are Calvinists. Because Calvinists have this doctrine that basically says if you are, you know, if you're called, you're saved, and if you're saved, you're always saved, but you still have to work really hard to make sure that you're saved. And I've never, you know, logically speaking, that's one of the most difficult doctrines to wrap your heads around. It's interesting when you talk to a Calvinist, and I don't want to underplay this because I'm a pretty good guy, I'm pretty adequate at debating and discussing things with people. And I have had discussions with Calvinists that I've walked away from going, you know, they got the better of me on that. I don't quite understand how, because it seems like my position is more sound than theirs. But they're very, the ones who have really thought this through, they understand this in a way. It's hard to understand. It's hard for me to explain exactly how they perceive it. But they do have that belief. When we look at this and we approach this, how do we look at this? What does it mean to us when we don't believe in predestination or always having been called and always having been saved? How do we approach it?
When I was a kid, my mom would step out on the back porch and holler at me, tell me to come in at lunchtime. That's the way I see the calling that he's talking about. It's an invitation. It's an invitation response. And to me, that's what he's talking about when he says calling.
Okay.
And the election would be this similar. The choosing, he has provided the way and for you to accept that calling, that invitation.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in? I don't necessarily have a better answer than that. I'm sorry if you were expecting one.
Like I said,
I was.
so God is all-knowing, and He knows, you know, what we're going to do. He chose us at the very beginning. He knew us from the laying of the foundations of the world, and just because He knows what's going to happen doesn't negate the fact that we had free will in the middle. And is that kind of what you're asking for?
Well, I'm not, the way question I asked is kind of an open-ended one, and that is a legitimate point that we want to be aware of, is that God does know what's going to happen, but the knowledge of what's going to happen doesn't define the event. The event defines the knowledge. And so, although He's all-powerful, He chooses not to exercise His power in a way that would well, He chose to create us with free will and not to take it away from us. And so yeah, the problem for me, the biggest problem for me with Calvinism is this idea of an irresistible call. That if you're called, if you're chosen, you can't stop it. You have to do it, and you cannot get in unless you've been chosen. Unless you're one of the ones that God specifically picked ahead of time, you can't get in. And so basically, free will either is an illusion under one way of looking at it, or it's irrelevant. But either way, I'm not okay with that. You know, both because of how I was raised, because I come from a Western society, because I, spend a lot of time in the legal profession where people have consequences for the choices they make. I don't accept the idea that we don't have the ability to make choices that are meaningful for us, because it's, Paul spends too much time talking about the consequences of making bad choices and avoiding those, for me to think that it's not important what choices we make and that it doesn't have relevance. I got a bunch of hands. Let me start with Sue, and then I will come to Sue, and then I will go back to Don.
Okay, so in 1 Peter, Peter uses this word a lot, chosen. In 1 Peter he says, to those who are scattered throughout Asia and all that, who are chosen. And then he said in chapter 2, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. Okay, so we're chosen that way. And then in verse 10 it says, for you were once not a people. Okay, so we are chosen by God, but not in the sense of Steve gets it and Karen doesn't. we are chosen in the idea that God chooses to love us. He chooses to love all mankind. That's probably the other way around. Anyway, we are, I mean, the Bible does talk about predestined and all of those things, but we have to be careful what we interpret that to mean. Because if you interpret it to mean that if God has chosen me personally to be saved, there's nothing I can do to undo that. Not a single thing I can do to undo that.
Right.
And if someone else has not been chosen, there's not a single thing they can do to be a child of God. And that's the wrong interpretation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And then you make a really good point. I'm glad you took us back to 1 Peter, because obviously 2 Peter is the letter he wrote afterwards, so what he's referring to is the same thing he's referring to in the first letter. And that notion of being chosen, see, I think when we think about chosen, a lot of times we think about it in terms of like Jesus chose the 12 apostles, you know? But he didn't just, for the most part, randomly go out and choose them. Most of them, actually, he chose or called as disciples, and then later, once they're all there, he goes through and actually designates 12 of them to be apostles. So he didn't, for example, when he goes up to Matthew at the tax collector's booth, he says, "Come follow me." He doesn't say, "Come be one of my apostles." We actually read in the scriptures, in I forget which of the Gospels it is, where Jesus has them there, and then he goes through, when there are all 12 of them, as well as a number of other disciples around, and he goes around and designates those 12. And so they're not. It's not a calling, or it's not a choosing in the sense of he just randomly picks some people who are just doing their own thing and said, "All right, come be my apostle." You know, that was where he was going with it, and I think he knew all along when he went and called Matthew, and he went and called Peter and Andrew and James and John, that they were going to become his apostles. But he didn't start off with them at that point. He called anybody who was willing to follow him. People would come up and say, "I want to follow you," and he'd say, "Okay, just do this," or whatever. And people would follow him. And so he had a number of people who followed him, in some cases throughout his entire lifetime, who were not the 12 apostles. They were called to get special education, to be given special gifts later on, but they were not the only ones chosen in general. He was calling everybody, and those who would listen were the ones who became his disciples. And so when we talk about this calling and this choosing, these kinds of notions, number one, I think we have to remember that what we're talking about is that being called in the broad sense. And number two, then, I think the notion of choosing is that once we respond to that call, then God says, you're in. There's nobody that comes and responds to the call and God says, "I'm sorry, you failed to meet the minimum standards." You know, you can't come in. Now, we do have an example with the sorcerer Stephen, who converted Simon. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. It didn't seem right to me.
Man, you're keeping it on.
Close to the same places in the scriptures, but not. So Simon, we have the example of Simon. Now Simon seems to have converted legitimately, but once he starts to see the apostles come and they are laying on hands and giving the ability to perform miracles to people, what he wants isn't the ability to perform miracles. He wants the ability to give other people the power to perform miracles, and he starts offering them money. And that's when the apostles recognize that he's not really in this for the right reasons, or at least he's been corrupted by what he's seen happening, and they have to sort of reset him. But he does at least begin as a believer, and certainly once they reproach him for what he's doing, he changes his way of thinking about it. So we see people who respond, who don't quite necessarily understand the nature of what they're responding to, and sometimes even, but nevertheless, there is a response involved. Now I have Sue's hand and then I have Dawn's hand. So go ahead, Sue.
Well, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but we actually kind of feel weird if we think we're actually hearing something when we're being called or whatever. But sometimes don't you wonder where your conscience comes from? Why is it making it so hard for me to go against good? I think the conscience has part of that built into it.
I think the Spirit moves people towards God, and in some places, sometimes you feel much more moved in that direction than others, and some people listen a lot more closely to that little voice. You know, the scriptures talk about our consciences being seared, if we don't listen to them enough and we kind of tamp them down and make them shut up long enough, that we stop being able to hear them, or it becomes very, very difficult to hear them. And so that calling, that notion of being called, I don't know, the calling is not nearly as big of a thing, I think, from the standpoint of trying to deal with the with predestination and some of those things as the choosing part is. That's where we get a little more hung up. Because I think the call is to everybody. When we talk about the gospel call, and so the calling is for everyone, not just for some. The choosing, I think, is once you respond to the call, you're part of this now. Being baptized is part of the process of being accepted by God, and then we are welcomed into the church universal. All right, Don, go ahead.
I feel kind of foggy this morning, bear with me.
What's that?
I said I feel kind of foggy this morning, so bear with me. But so I visualize it like this. I mean, we were created, God created, I believe that when God said, let there be light, that was the Big Bang. Okay, and God is outside of the universe, and I don't believe that the universe is infinite in size like we're told it is by science. I think God looks down on the whole universe as a little bitty spark, a momentary spark. And anyway, he looks at our entire life kind of like we can look at history, because we're in the fabric of time. So we can say on this date somebody did this, and this was what was going on around him and everything else, and he sees our future that way, and we can't see that. So he knows what dates you're going to be saved on, he knows what dates you're going to get married on, he knows what you're going to do every moment of your life, and that doesn't change the fact that you had free will at those particular moments and you made your decision, but he still knew what was going to be the final outcome. He knows when you're going to pass away, he knows where you're going.
Yeah.
And he knew that when he said, let there be light.
And part of the thing, and you have a very similar, maybe the very same conception that I do. Part of the thing that I look at is the problem with knowledge of the future is that we think it locks the future into place. And if the person who had that knowledge was operating within our time and our physical and time-based state, that might be true, but God is not part of the system. God transcends the system. And so there's it's astonishing how many physical laws of physics end in a closed system. All of the laws of thermodynamics require a closed system, all of these different things. So when you take something outside of the system, the rules of the physical world don't apply, and God is outside of the system, so his knowledge of what's happening does not change the ability of people within the system to make decisions, and to have agency within the system as well. So I think when we're looking at it from that standpoint, I don't have any problem at all reconciling God's knowledge of our future with our ability to still make choices. Because like you said, I think of it like history. Just because I know when George Washington crossed the Delaware didn't make George Washington cross the Delaware. That would be a misunderstanding of how the causality of it works. Now, on the other hand, when God issues a prophecy, that does lock in something. When you have the prophets talking about a child that's going to be born, or talking about a famine that's going to happen, or whatever it is, that is now a future that is set and going to happen. From that standpoint. So it's a very, at least from the human standpoint, now there have been times where at least twice I can think of where God said this is what I'm going to do, which theoretically would be a certainty, and yet he changed his mind and didn't do it. So that's kind of an interesting side note there. But so we've got these complicated ideas, but the issue we want to kind of hit on or finish up on before we go too far here is the choosing. I got 3 more hands, so let me start with Karen, and then I'll go to Mark, and then I'll go to Jerry. So go ahead, Karen.
Well, when it comes to the choosing, 2 Peter 3:9 talks about God's patience and how he wants all men to come to repentance.
Right.
So he wouldn't pick and choose if he wants all men to come to repentance.
Why not just quit now? I've got everybody I planned for, so.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Mark?
I was going to say, if you think about it, and I'm simplifying it, I know we're the new Israelites. We are the chosen people now.
Yeah.
If you look at them, they were God's chosen people, but he wiped a lot of them out because they didn't follow after his command, and their heart wasn't where it was supposed to be. And I think that's with this new covenant, our heart is the most important thing. Where is our heart at? It's not our outward things that we show other people. It's that. And we have to look at it that way, that we are the chosen people now. But if our heart's not in the right place, it'd be just the same thing. We still got to practice. We still got to, that's why he keeps layering on these things. If we were perfect from when he chose us, then why are we even trying, any of us? And I think that's a lot of it. I think if you think of it that way, he chose us, but it's because he's chosen all the Christians.
Yeah.
All the followers.
He chose Israel. And Paul in Romans makes exactly the point that you just did, which is that he says, they're not all Israel just because they're Israelites by name or by genetics or birth. There is spiritual Israel. That's not quite the term used, but he's talking about spiritual Israel, and he talks about the Gentile Christians as being grafted in branches to that main vine that Israel was. But he says those who fell away stopped being spiritual Israel, even though the people of Israel were chosen. And so what's happening is we're being added to that chosen race by our salvation. It's not that we are operating somehow where we've been chosen and other people haven't been chosen. We're being added in and made part of a chosen group. He has chosen. The elect are the ones who have responded to the gospel, and they've been obedient, and they have love for God. These are the people who are chosen. And so it's kind of a backward concept, and I'll get a little more to the language of that in a second, but I want to let Jerry share his thoughts with us first.
In 2 Thessalonians, Paul, I think, answers a great deal of this, what is calling and what is the choosing. In verse 14 of chapter 2, he says, to which he, Christ, called you by our gospel. I mean, that in simple terms, we're called by the gospel.
Right.
And then in verse 13, he says, and Paul says that from the beginning, he chose you for salvation through sanctification of the Spirit and belief in the truth. I mean, to me, those two verses that Paul explains the calling and the choosing.
And I think the other thing we have to be aware of, and I waited until kind of the last of this to kind of bring this out because it's a little bit, it makes my head hurt sometimes. So one of the things that we have to appreciate is the difference between modern Western thinking about free will and thinking that they had at the time about free will. Peter, John, Paul, all the people who were writing in the Bible. By the time the Bible is done being written, the modern day notions of free will and some of those things really don't even, they're just a spark on the horizon for most people. Now, the notion of consequence exists, and the notion of making choices exists, but if you look throughout the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament, you see lots of references made by people to things that people had to do. Pharaoh, God says, it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened so that he did wrong. God flat out says to Moses, I'm going to make it so Pharaoh can't make the right choices because I want to level judgment against Egypt. Now, that speaks to a way of thinking about God and thinking about his power that we are uncomfortable with to some extent because we believe in the idea of free will. And some of that is probably a cultural understanding of the concept, that they had a very different understanding culturally than we did. But what's interesting is however you want to conceive of it, if we go through the scriptures, what you find over and over again is things like, he wants everybody to be saved. Things like, go and preach the gospel to all the world, baptizing them. And so many different places where it talks about you making a choice, you being, putting on Christ in baptism, you doing, all these different things. It makes these references to you choosing. And by the same token, it makes lots of references to be careful not to miss out, be careful not to fall away, be careful. So this notion that God is choosing us, we may not fully understand that. In fact, I'm pretty confident we don't, because we're limited in our ability to understand God. And it doesn't really matter exactly what it looks like, as long as we understand that there's different people who thought about it in different ways throughout there, but the scriptures teach us clearly and repeatedly, far more often than they use terms like election and predestination, they use terms about you making choices and there being consequences for your choices, and not having an end to those consequences and those choices until your life ends. You have the choice right up until the end, and then the choice is done. You've made your choices and the consequences are there. So we don't necessarily have to have every right answer, every explanation of some of this stuff, any more than I have to be able to explain where angels came from or demons came from, or how God, how Jesus. I've always wanted to see visually how Jesus turned 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough food to feed 5,000 people. Because did he like set up a basket and do it behind there like some sort of a magic trick? I mean, because imagine if you're watching this happen and he's breaking the bread apart. Like visually, what happens? It's like one of those paintings, that M.C. Escher guy who would like do all those weird like things with dimensions and make you like dizzy when you look at his paintings. How does that work? I can't wrap my head around that because I'm limited by my physical form and my physical understanding. And so when we get to some of these words, sometimes we have to step back and say, okay, we don't really know exactly how to define this, but we know how it works in practice because we can see what goes on in the scriptures and how people are functioning in the scriptures, and we can look at the overall arc of the teaching and understand what must be meant, or at least what we're expected to do, how we're expected to respond. So that's I think that's an important thing to understand. Now, that's not the most satisfying answer to a question like this all the time, but sometimes it's the right answer. We don't always have all the answers to what God is saying.
I was going to say, you study with different denominations. I know the Mormons, if you study with them, and they'll want to study up to the point that you say, can I get to heaven? Can I figure out how to get to heaven with just my Bible? And you back them into that corner, and they have to say yes, because it's there. The gospel is
Actually,
there.
they don't.
Huh?
Not anymore.
They won't now,
No,
but
they
years
used to.
ago, they would say yes. They would actually be truthful. And then I'd say, well, then why do I need these added things? Because it's simple. The Bible was written for simple people. That's who Christ picked, simple people.
Right.
And I think we want to add all these rules and all these other weird things to it when he said, hey, just follow my simple plan and you're there. But you got to stay with the plan. You can't go off on your own. You can't practice other things that a man has brought up.
Right.
Stick with me and I'll get you there. And I think we want to say, no way, it can't be that simple. Really, can it? Can it be that simple? And we want to say, no, it can't be. I got to do something else. I got to work my butt off to get there. And he said, no, you just got to stay with what I taught you, the simple stuff.
Right.
Be good to everybody. Do the things that how you want to be treated. Treat people that way. That's super simple. Everybody can understand that, but we want to add other things, and I think that's a lot of this is we want to add a bunch of stuff that's going to make us stumble.
Yeah.
We can't live up to that.
Right. We want to make the rules because
Yeah.
we don't like having somebody else make the rules. All right, Don?
I think the Lord just wants us all to come to the place that Job did, that we're gonna praise him no matter what happens, and to trust him, that he's sovereign and all-knowing, and that his judgments are good and righteous and right, and
Yeah.
period.
Yeah, that's true. He does want us to do that, one way or another. And Steve, did I see your hand?
But I'll comment that this very set of scriptures you have here actually debunks the idea that we are called and chosen exclusively by God, because he starts off with, if you lack these qualities, you need to get them.
Right. Right. Yeah.
If you lack this, you need to get that, out of respect for his calling and
Right.
choosing.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
So, all right, so let's take a look at some of the less controversial aspects of this. And in particular, what I want to look at is this idea of blindness and short-sightedness in particular. So it's interesting because Jesus talks about blindness, spiritual blindness, on a lot of different occasions. But in particular, when it comes to the parables, and we looked at this actually earlier this year, we looked at parables. And so it says, as soon as he was alone, this was after I believe it was after the parable of the sower, his followers, along with the 12, began asking him about the parables. And he was saying to them, to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to those who are outside get everything in parables, so that while seeing they may see and not perceive, and while hearing they may hear and not understand, otherwise they might return and be forgiven. Now, that sounds like what he's saying is we're deliberately misleading people and keeping them confused so they can't be saved. But in other places where it talks about this, what he actually says is, you are seeing or hearing, seeing without perceiving, and you are hearing without actually listening and understanding. He doesn't say that I'm keeping you from doing it. What he's saying is, you won't let it in. You won't pay attention. Because notice here, it's not just the 12. The mistake we make sometimes is thinking that it's just the 12 who are getting all the secret information, that he's telling them. Now, they were given a portion of the Spirit, they were given some miraculous abilities, but later on there's a group of 72 of them, in addition, or along with the 12, who are given miraculous abilities. But notice here he says, his followers along with the 12. So it's all of these people that are following him are saying, what does this mean? And he says to all of his followers, here's the explanation. You have been given the ability to understand this, and I'm going to explain it to you because it'll make sense to you. But somebody who's not my follower, somebody who doesn't want to listen to me, I could explain it to them and they're still not going to get it. So they're outside because they chose to be outside. They're not outside because he wouldn't let them come in. They're outside because they don't want to be there. So the followers ask him for the explanation where the other ones don't even care. They're like, well, that was an interesting story. I'm going to go home and make dinner. That's where they're at, So it's not being hidden from people because God doesn't want people to know it. It's being hidden from people because they will not look into it and understand it and accept it. And even today this is true. I mean, today the Scriptures have been fully revealed. There's nothing hidden or secret about the Scriptures now. Now, as Mark said, we go looking for ways to create new hidden and secret things about the Scriptures all the time. But the truth is that it's right there for us to see and for us to perceive if we will open it up and read it with an open mind and a clear conscience, or maybe not a clear conscience, but a clear, with faith, bring some faith to the table. But people who won't do that, they can look at this book all the time, and there are people who are more expert in the Scriptures than I will ever be because of how much they've studied it, and they don't believe a word of it, or it doesn't matter to them. It doesn't change them in any way. Biblical scholars at universities, people who've studied the Scriptures, they can tell you more about the individual texts that have been used to compose the Scriptures and where he found them and everything else. It doesn't matter to them. It's just a book. It's just a historical document that's interesting, or a document in history, not even a historical document, but it doesn't change anything. So it's how you approach what is there that affects your ability to see and your ability to hear. And so he calls them blind and short-sighted because they have forgotten. They forgot how they got to that knowledge in the first place, and now it doesn't mean anything to them. And so we have to be very careful when we approach the Bible, that we are approaching it from a standpoint of faith. That doesn't mean we can't find humor in the Bible sometimes. I definitely do. It doesn't mean we can't, sometimes use it for things like Bible, where it's more about memorization and recall, because that's the foundation of my biblical knowledge. I did Bible for 6 years, from when I was in 7th grade until I was in 12th grade, and my knowledge of the Bible was hugely built upon that stuff. And so there's a lot of ways that it can be used that is productive, but most of all it comes from people who have faith when they approach it and actually read it and listen to it. Mark?
I like just that one sentence right there. They began asking him about it. They wanted to know. You told us the story. We know there's more behind this. Tell us. And that's the same thing with us. We want to, as faithful Christians, we want to know things. We want to look in the Scriptures and say, hey, what does this mean in my life? How can I put that into the way I do things? And I think it's the same thing. There's people, like you said, there's some people out there, they know it, they've heard it, but they don't want to put it into their lives. They could care less.
Yeah.
The world says do this, and that's what I do.
And an enormous number of the people that were following Jesus around were there because they wanted to see miracles, because they wanted to get fed, because there was literally nothing else to do. I mean, it wasn't like they could go surf the web or something like that. Many of them lived very, very drab and dull lives, where it was basically just work and then go home, work and go home. And so somebody going around teaching things and saying stuff and being in a crowd, it was interesting, just like going and watching a movie. You don't leave a movie going, all right, I'm motivated to change my life now. Not most of the time anyway, But you go because you're bored and you want something fun to do. And that's what a lot of the people following Jesus were, just looking for something interesting to do, something to watch, something to hear. And once he told his stories, they're like, all right, that was fun, I'm going home. But there's the followers, the ones who stay behind that actually, as Mark said, they listen and they ask. They want to know what this means. And so as Jesus becomes increasingly more complex in some of the things he talks about, it eventually leads up to where he talks about eating his body and drinking his flesh, and that's when a bunch of the followers are like, yeah, we're not even going to ask about that. Let's leave it. That's too weird for us. But nevertheless, those followers are the ones who get the insight to understand that more is going on here than just a story about somebody sowing seed. Or more is going on here than just a story about somebody throwing a mustard seed into the ground and having it grow up, or whatever it is. They're understanding because they're asking the questions. What does this mean? How does this, what are you talking about here? And so God has these mysteries. Now Paul talks about the mystery, and there was a mystery that was deliberately hidden. And it's hard to be sure whether he's talking about the salvation of the Gentiles or whether he's talking about the plan of salvation in general. I actually think it's the latter of the two. Because, in particular, because I think if the plan of salvation had been something that was manifest and obvious for people to understand, Satan would have behaved very differently when Jesus was in the world. Don and I were actually talking about this, that I think that at some point in the crucifixion, Satan realized that this was actually not what he wanted to have happen. It was too late. Because while Satan can motivate people to do bad things, and he can tempt us and he can drive us, ultimately there is still free will. And once that ball was rolling too far, there was nothing he could do to stop it either. And suddenly, I think he's realizing that what's happening on the cross is not what he thought was happening. He thought he was going to torture and kill the Son of God, and instead this whole different thing is going on. And he would have liked to probably pull back on that at some point, But because the mystery was hidden from him too, he didn't see it coming, because nobody would see it coming this way. Nobody would expect God to use sacrifice of his own Son to save the world. And so it sneaks up on people. So I think that's the mystery. But regardless, there were things that were hidden. Absolutely, because you can't, it's just like when the president gets up and talks about we're at war, and the president gets up and talks about what's happening, and the press asks him some of the stupidest, well, how many divisions are you sending over there? Well, I'm probably not going to tell you that, am I? Because when are they landing? Where will they be landing? And what's the first city you're going to bomb? We wouldn't tell you those things, because then the other side would know what's going to happen. I think there are things that were hidden, not just because people weren't supposed to know, but because there's another side to this, and you don't want them to know. And so there are definitely times where that's true, but at this point, with the sacrifice of Christ, with the redemptive and his resurrection, there's nothing that needs to be hidden anymore, because Satan has lost. There's nothing he can do to win the fight after this. All he can do is make as many people miserable as possible and tempt as many people astray as possible. It's basically the consolation prize. It's kind of like, the 1-in-12 football team, winning the game against the undefeated team, and they're celebrating like they've won the Super Bowl, but the truth is, they just upset one team and they just ruined their day. And that's pretty much what Satan lives for at this point. Not to win, just to make everybody else miserable. So that's kind of, I think, where we're at with this. But these mysteries that have been revealed to everyone now still have to be approached by faith, or you're not going to get them. So, any more comments on that before we move on? Okay, I've got Jerry and...
I was just thinking that, we still ask. We ask about, how to understand this particular scripture, or this thought, this idea. We still ask those questions, or we should be asking those questions. And I over 80 years, I've observed that I will be studying something and absolutely not understand it, and look at something, and in the middle of the night, it makes sense. Then I understand it. So someplace in there, I don't know if it's the Spirit or just study, but something answers that question.
Yeah. I think it's a little of each. And I think, and I think what's fascinating to me about the gospel, about the scriptures, is that on the one level, as Mark said, you can tell it to a child and a child can understand.
Yeah.
You have to simplify some of the aspects of it for it to not overwhelm them, but you can tell a child the gospel story and they can understand the idea, even if they don't understand everything about sacrifice and blood and all this different stuff. You can tell them, and you can, the Christian who comes in who knows very little about the Bible, nothing about theology, can come in and study it and understand it and apply it and be saved. And yet, we can live our entire lives and keep studying it and find more and more meaning and truth in there. as long as we don't try to add stuff to it or to warp it to our own purposes. Because there are layers and layers and layers of truth there, because ultimately we're delving into the mind of God. Not that we're ever going to understand it, and for that reason, that's why there's always more and more layers, because God is infinitely more complex than we can understand. And so on the one hand, He's revealed to us a very straightforward and simple truth and how to live it. On the other hand, He has given us a fountain of knowledge that is inexhaustible, which is, I mean, if you really needed proof that something was from God, that would seem to be a pretty good argument right there, because I'll tell you what, if you go you go into a law library and look at all the U.S. code, it fills up like this wall with just U.S. code. And there is a lot of information in there, but there is very little wisdom in there. You know? On the other end, the Constitution is, you know, I mean, basically in 12.5, it filled about maybe four of these pages, maybe 5. And it is filled with wisdom and very, very little information, because it's wise enough to not try to define everything. It's wise enough to basically say, okay, here's the framework, you go build something on, you know? And so the greater wisdom is the ability to present something simply that is complex and let people unpack it for themselves, you know? Okay, any last comments on that before we move on to the next bit here? So briefly, go ahead.
Sincerely and earnestly seeking, ye shall find.
That's right. Those who truly seek, those who is what the scriptures say. So, okay, we talked about this a little bit already, but this calling you're choosing, it reminded me of something Jesus says in Matthew. He says, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will know them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. So I think there's two big reasons why I included this in here. The first is to remind us that choice matters. It's what we do and not just what we say. It's the choices that we make through choosing to do what God wants and be the kind of people God wants. But also I want you to notice here, God does make choices. He's choosing your good fruit, your bad fruit, you're done. You are the ones I want. So God chooses and differentiates based on our fruits, based on our response to Him. And so it's not a matter, like I said, of designating some for salvation and others are lost. It's a matter of recognizing those who have responded to the call and who are living the gospel, as opposed to those who are either not responding at all or who are just giving it lip service. Okay, let's go on to this next. Actually, let's stop there because we're at 12:15. Wow, we're way over time. We're at 10:15, so we'll stop here.